All right, hi there, Kate. We're so
Hi.
glad to have you this week.
Thanks for having me. Let's talk admissions.
Well, I think the biggest news to talk about is the latest news with Harvard. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Harvard and testing?
So, Harvard just reinstated their testing policies. So now you will be required to submit ACT and SAT scores if you want to apply to Harvard for this next application cycle, which will be the class of 2029.
And this is kind of following a trend with a few schools. Is that correct?
Yep, Yale, Harvard, Dartmouth. There's been a few schools that have been signaling that essentially they need more data. And also that Dartmouth specifically did a study where it showed that standardized testing is a much better, much more perfect indicator of student potential at their school and student success at their school. So judging a student based on a transcript or essays is just no longer enough. There's just not enough data to be able to determine whether or not they're going to succeed at their school and graduate.
This is really interesting. So, what would you suggest for students that are getting ready to apply to college in the upcoming year? What sort of strategy should they have around testing?
So students who want to apply to these elite schools should be implementing a test prep strategy, which means you should be planning to test. Unfortunately, for some of these schools, you just won't be able to apply without test scores anyway. But what is lesser known is that test scores actually double your chances. Like at Emory, students who submitted test scores, even though they had a test optional policy at the time, were twice as likely to be admitted. So a lot of this stuff, there's not a lot of transparency. So stuff that happened during COVID, once they started receiving so many applications and they had to be able to figure out, okay, well, all these applicants are like very, very similar in profile. How do we determine who we admit? Students who submitted test scores are like, well, we have test scores for these kids, so of course we're going to admit them, because that's another data point that these other students just didn't have. So it's usually going to help you to have strong test scores. So implementing a test prep strategy and implementing not just having a Princeton review coach. Sometimes Princeton review or these like very standard test prep programs, you don't control what type of coach you get. A lot of the time you're getting like a student just out of college or a graduate student, and they just don't have as much experience to be able to ensure that your points get boosted enough.
So this is a really great point. I'd love if you could go into a bit further, because I know that in your test prep and the partners you work with, it's all very customized.
Yes.
Maybe could you talk a little bit about what you see the purpose of test prep serving, both in terms of filling content gaps and also preparing them how to test?
Yeah, so when we hear students, and we've heard this a lot in the last few years, say, well, I'm not going to test because it's test optional and I'm not a good test taker anyway. What that signals to us is that you never learned how to take tests and you have major skill gaps that need to be addressed. So being a bad test taker is really what we think of it as, is it's for the most part a cop-out, because we can train you and teach you how to become a great test taker and also fill in these skill gaps that you have that will enable you to actually shift into college level work with greater ease and success.
Now, if someone is not applying to Harvard, you mentioned this earlier, maybe they're at a school that's still marked as test optional. What is your advice for them? Should they still be submitting test scores and trying to test and increase their tests, or should they not submit test scores? What's your take on this for non-Harvard students?
I'm not recommending any of my students to go test optional unless it's a very specific case, unless that student is really doesn't need to, based on a very specific set of circumstances. But for the most part, I'm going to be suggesting to all of my clients that they develop a test prep strategy, that they work with our test prep expert. Because like I said, like Emory revealed, like if you have standardized test scores and you submit, you were twice as likely to be admitted. Your admit rate is now double what it would be if you were not submitting scores. That's remarkable. So Yes, what we are recommending is to absolutely plan to test and plan to submit those scores.
Now, based on what you've seen, do you think more schools are going to start saying, hey, we need to take tests again and make it less optional? Do you think that trend will continue? Is it even a trend yet, would you say?
I would say for some colleges, they will hang on to test optional because they believe that it promotes greater access and equity for college, which in some cases it does. For students who don't have access to good test prep, for students who it does limit their options and access to college. So some schools will be very deeply committed to test optional. But I will say that if you come from a middle class, upper middle class background and you have access to these resources, colleges expect you to have done test prep. Like, unless you were in a very extreme circumstance, you should absolutely be testing. The colleges will not give you a pass on that. They'll give other students from underserved backgrounds a pass, but not a student who has access. Sadly, sorry. That's just the reality of admissions landscape right now.
And if someone is on their own to do test prep and might not have access to resources, what would you suggest there for how they could be pursuing test prep?
Well, there's tons of SAT and ACT tests online. Well, now that we've shifted to the digital SAT, there are fewer. I mean, they've released about 4 or 5, maybe more by now, by the time you're watching this video. But go online and take a look at those sample tests that have already been released, because that is where you need to put all your energy into practicing. Unfortunately, because of this shift to digital SAT, we have a lot less prep material, but that will be building as the months go by. And I want to keep in mind that for students who are taking the digital SAT and really struggled with it, if you score very low on your first SAT, it might signal that you're better off taking the ACT, for instance. So you want to pay attention to those like blind sample tests that you take.
Talk to us a little bit about that. Are SAT and ACT both accepted these days? Is one better than the other? How do you decide what to take?
Yeah, one is definitely not better than the other. The content, even if you study for the ACT and you end up taking the SAT, it's one of those things where the content is basically the same. So your prep is for the most part, the content will be the same, just the format will be different. So one is definitely not better than the other. Some students find the SAT better to take. Other students find the ACT better to take. It just depends on who you are academically.
Wow, this has been so helpful. Any last remarks on the latest news from Harvard?
I just think that it's been a really touch and go few years, and it's so interesting that standardized testing is coming back, because what happened with the Common App, where schools can receive so many more applications now because it's just a click of a button. Being able to differentiate between applicants and having more data points is so important. And that's what you have to remember. Like, everybody looks at standardized testing as the bad guy, but actually standardized testing can really help you and benefit you in more ways than just the application process. It can be something that teaches you long-term test-taking skills and also makes sure that you don't bypass really important skills you're going to need for higher level college level classes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Maybe in closing, you could just share with us, besides all the test-taking stuff we've talked about, what's the benefit of coming to one of your free essay workshops, and how can that help someone stand out from the crowd?
Well, our essay workshops are famous because students find them so much fun. I do a ton of storytelling, so it's not like super boring and academic. It's more about what are the 3 secrets to writing a really great college essay. And I promise you that if you come to this hour-long workshop, you're going to walk away with so much knowledge about, okay, I know how to start my essay now. Oh, I've got a couple hooks that I can use to open up my essay. Ooh, I know how to fit way more information into 650 words than I could have done before I came to this. So highly recommend you join my workshop. You are missing out if you don't come. It is so highly valuable. Thousands of students have taken my workshops and they love it. And you know what? The sooner you come, the better. Even if you're watching this really early in the process, it's good because you want to keep thinking and keep like ideating. You want more time than less for ideating your creative essay.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us today.
Thanks for having me.